Hey, welcome. So today we are digging into something huge. How nearly 200 years of British rule didn't just govern India, but totally rewired its entire economy. We're going to look at the key policies that reshaped a whole subcontinent and left behind a legacy that, well, we're still grappling with today. Let's get into it.
So, to really get a grip on just how massive these changes were, we first have to ask a simple question. What was the starting point? What did the economy actually look like on the ground before the East India Company showed up and became a ruling power?
Well, before the British, the whole land system was just built differently. If you were the one tilling the land, you pretty much owned it through these customary rights. Now, you had these figures called zamindars, sure, but they were just tax collectors for the state. They were not landlords. And this is the key part. Land wasn't really a commodity you could just sell. You couldn't do it without the whole village basically agreeing to it.
And that brings us to the first huge structural change the British made. They looked at this traditional system and didn't see stability. Nope. They saw it as inefficient, as something that was getting in the way of collecting revenue and maintaining control. So what did they do? They decided to remake the whole thing from the ground up. Their solution, which they rolled out in 1793, was called the zamindari system, and it was a game changer. With basically a single stroke of a pen, the zamindar went from being a simple tax collector to the legal owner of the land. And for the person actually working that land, their entire world was about to get turned upside down. And this slide just lays it out so clearly. Look at the left. The tiller owns the land. Pretty straightforward. Now look to the right. Under the British system, that same tiller is now a tenant, forced to rent the very land their family might have worked for generations. The landlord, that old tax collector, suddenly holds all the property rights. And just like that, land becomes an asset that can be bought, sold, and mortgaged. The consequences were, well, they were immediate and they were devastating. A lot of these new landlords didn't even live on their land. They became absentee landlords who were only interested in squeezing out as much rent as possible. To pay these crazy high rents, farmers had to switch from growing food for their families to growing cash crops like indigo. This often pushed them into debt with a whole new class of moneylenders. Productivity stalled, and by the end of it all, an absolutely astonishing 45% of the rural population owned no land at all. They were just farm laborers.
Now, changing the land ownership, as big as it was really just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The British also reoriented the entire economy to create what historians now call the drain of wealth, a systematic transfer of resources, of actual money and goods, straight from India to Britain. This whole idea was first really nailed down by an Indian intellectual named Dadabhai Naoroji. Way back in 1867, he was arguing that India's growing poverty wasn't because of some internal problem. No, he said it was a direct result of colonial rule itself. So the question is, how did this drain actually work? There were three main ways it happened. First up was trade. The British used Indian tax money to buy Indian goods, textiles, spices, you name it. Then they exported them. What that means is Britain got all these valuable goods for free without spending a single piece of its own gold or silver. Second, there were the huge salaries and private profits of British officials, all paid for by the Indian taxpayer. And third, these things called home charges, which meant India was literally paying the bills for the British government's offices in London and for its military costs. The effect this had on India's world-famous industries was just catastrophic. This slide here tells the whole story of deindustrialization. For centuries, India was a global giant in textiles. Under British rule, it was flipped. It went from a producer of high-value finished goods into a supplier of raw cotton for the factories in Manchester. And then, as the ultimate irony, India became a captive market, forced to buy back the finished cloth from Britain. And the numbers, they're just hard to wrap your head around. In just 17 years, between 1815 and 1832, India's textile exports fell by 92%. Think about that. An entire industrial base, built over centuries, was practically wiped out in less than a single generation. Okay, let's talk about one of the most visible and, frankly, most controversial legacies of the Raj, the railways. They're often held up as this great gift of modernization, but the reality, it is way more complicated than that. It was truly a double-edged sword. Okay, so on the one hand, you can see the appeal. The railways absolutely connected India in a way that had never happened before, which helped create a sense of national unity.
They created a national market, they helped get crops to port cities, and yeah, in some cases, they did help move food to areas hit by famine. These are the positive arguments you always hear.
But now for the reality check. First, the enormous cost of building them was paid for entirely by Indian taxpayers. Second, the routes weren't built for Indians. They were designed to serve British interests. Get raw materials out of the country, get British goods into the country, and move troops around to crush any dissent. On top of that, it was a completely European-run operation. Indians were kept out of all the senior jobs and were even overcharged as passengers in what was basically a system of racial discrimination. So, after all of this, the remade land system, the drain of wealth, the railways built for colonial needs, what was the end result? What did the Indian economy actually look like when the British finally packed up and left in 1947?
Let's start with this number. In 1947, the literacy rate in India was just 15%. After nearly 2 centuries of rule, the vast majority of the population had been left without even a basic education. And this one might be even more shocking. The average life expectancy was just 32 years. That single number tells you everything you need to know about public health, about nutrition, about the depth of the poverty for the average person. And what about that industrial powerhouse India used to be? By 1947, modern large-scale industry employed a tiny 2% of the workforce. The deindustrialization was so total that the Industrial Revolution that Britain was so proud of, well, for India, it just never arrived.
So here's the crucial takeaway. The colonial period wasn't just a phase of foreign rule. It was a complete economic restructuring with a devastating long-term legacy. And that leaves us with one final massive question. When you're faced with these conditions in 1947, how on earth do you even begin to rebuild a nation?